The historical figure later known as General Franco was born on December 4, 1892 under the name Francisco Franco Bahamonde in the coastal town of El Ferrol, located in Galicia in northwestern Spain. His father, Nicolas Franco, came from an Andalusian lineage with a long tradition of service in the Spanish Navy, a legacy that stretched back 6 generations to the early 18th century. Nicolas himself followed this path, serving as an officer in the Spanish Naval Administrator's Corps during the late 19th century. Despite this shared naval background, the relationship between Nicolas and his son Francisco was deeply troubled. Nicolas was known for his eccentric behavior and somewhat decadent lifestyle, qualities that Francisco came to resent and strongly disapprove of as he grew older. Francisco's mother, Maria del Pilar Bahamonde de Andrade, was a native Galician woman from a prosperous upper-middle-class family. Francisco developed a close bond with his mother and held her in high regard, particularly admiring her strong Roman Catholic faith and her serious, reserved personality, which stood in sharp contrast to his father's character. Influenced by his upbringing, Francisco himself became disciplined, reserved, and serious from an early age. Initially, Francisco was expected to pursue a career in the Spanish Navy, continuing the long family tradition. However, his life changed dramatically in 1907, when he was just 14 years old. That year, his father abandoned the family and later remarried another woman in Madrid. Francisco never reconciled with this betrayal and maintained only minimal contact with his father for the rest of his life. It is no coincidence that around the same time his father left the family home in Galicia, Francisco abandoned his plans to enter the Navy. Instead, at the age of 14, he enrolled in the Spanish Infantry Academy in Toledo. This decision was also influenced by the sharp decline of the Spanish Navy following Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War of 1898, which had significantly reduced the Navy's prestige and opportunities. Francisco completed his training in 1910, graduating as a second lieutenant. His academic performance at the Infantry Academy was fairly average, placing him toward the lower end of his class. However, this outcome can partly be explained by his youth, as many of his fellow cadets were 2 or 3 years older and more physically mature than he was. The Spain that Franco entered as a young military officer was approaching a prolonged period of political instability. In reality, the country had been experiencing various forms of crisis for nearly 2 centuries. During the 16th century, Spain had been Europe's dominant power, a global superpower supported by a vast empire in the Americas and enormous inflows of gold and silver from regions such as Mexico and Peru. This dominance began to fade in the 17th century, as precious metal shipments from the Americas declined, triggering a rapid imperial and economic downturn. By the 18th century, Spain had become a secondary power with a weak, underdeveloped economy. Its political system was further weakened by the overwhelming influence of the Roman Catholic Church and an ineffective monarchy. In the early 19th century, independence movements across South and Central America stripped Spain of most of its overseas empire, dealing another severe blow to its global standing. At the same time, efforts to reform the country were beginning to emerge. In the early years of the 19th century, Spain came under the influence of Napoleonic France, and a new generation of political thinkers began calling for sweeping changes to Spain's political institutions, economy, and social structure. These efforts led to the adoption of a liberal constitution in 1812, though deep divisions persisted. As a result, the country descended into the First Carlist War, 1833 to 1840, a conflict rooted in disputes over royal succession and ideological struggles between liberals and conservatives. 2 additional Carlist wars followed, one in the late 1840s and another in the mid-1870s. The Third Carlist War briefly resulted in the suspension of the monarchy and the establishment of the First Spanish Republic between 1873 and 1874. Consequently, by the time Franco was born in 1892, Spain had endured nearly a century of continuous political conflict. This struggle pitted left-leaning liberal reformers, who sought to limit the power of the monarchy, aristocracy, and Catholic Church, against right-wing conservatives determined to preserve Spain's traditional political and social order. These opposing forces continued to dominate Spanish politics into the early 20th century and would play a decisive role in shaping Franco's future. When Franco graduated from the Infantry Academy in 1910, the catastrophic political clashes that would engulf Spain in the 1930s were still years away. At that time, Spain's primary concerns lay in North Africa, where it retained some of the last remnants of its former colonial empire. Having lost most of its territories in the Caribbean and the Philippines during the late 1890s, Spain increasingly focused on Morocco as a key imperial interest. Spain had maintained a presence in Morocco for centuries, most notably through its control of Ceuta, located across the Strait of Gibraltar. Spanish involvement in the region expanded further following the First Hispano-Moroccan War, 1859 to 1860, as well as smaller clashes with Rif tribes in northern Morocco in 1893 and again in 1909. A major territorial expansion occurred in November 1912, when Spain and France signed a treaty formally dividing Morocco between the two powers. Under the agreement reached by the European powers, Spain obtained control of the entire northern coastline of Morocco along with a narrow strip of territory in the south, while France assumed authority over the much larger central regions of the country. Although this arrangement formally defined the spheres of influence of both nations, enforcing Spanish authority in its designated areas proved to be a long and difficult process. The task of subduing and controlling the many tribes and political factions in Morocco demanded sustained military engagement, occupying Spanish forces throughout the remainder of the 1910s. It was in this context that Franco, having recently graduated from the military academy in Toledo, volunteered for service in North Africa in 1912, at just 19 years old. Franco's deployment to Morocco marked the beginning of his rapid rise within the Spanish armed forces. In 1913, he was promoted to the rank of first lieutenant and assigned to an elite Moroccan cavalry unit. He quickly gained recognition for his discipline, leadership skills, and professional conduct, as well as for the care and concern he demonstrated toward the soldiers under his command. In 1915, he achieved another promotion, becoming a captain, the youngest individual in the entire Spanish army to hold that rank. However, in 1916, he suffered a severe gunshot wound to the abdomen. As a consequence of this injury, Franco, then only 24 years old, was sent back to Spain, where he remained for several years in southwestern Europe. The creation of the Spanish Foreign Legion in 1920 and Franco's appointment as second-in-command of the newly formed unit directly led to his return to North Africa in the early 1920s. This return coincided with the outbreak of another conflict between Spanish forces and the Berber tribes of the Rif Mountains, a war that would continue from 1921 until 1926. In 1923, Franco received another promotion, taking full command of the Spanish Foreign Legion. That same year, he married Maria del Carmen Polo, and in 1926 the couple welcomed a daughter, also named Maria del Carmen, who would remain Franco's only child. Shortly after his marriage in 1923, Franco was summoned to Madrid for a private audience with King Alfonso XIII. This meeting reflected Franco's growing prominence within Spain, earned largely through his military successes in Morocco. It also occurred during a period when the influence of the military was expanding significantly. In September 1923, the king gave his approval to what was effectively a coup led by General Miguel Primo de Rivera, who would govern Spain for the next 7 years under the slogan Country, Religion, Monarchy, signaling his intention to rule according to tradition.